contrast to that intro, this video will not be taking place on our Sunshine State rails. Folks, it's time for another out-of-state trip. And for once, one that's not accompanied by nothing but music for the entire time. This one is something new, and is going to have quite a few interesting elements to it. So, here I am, behind the microphone for the first time in 2 weeks, to narrate it. At this time, we're just now exiting our home state of Florida, and our destination was to be northern Georgia, so we had a bit of a drive to go. That would take us into the night, passing through the countryside, Cordele, and all the cotton fields that are blooming apparently at this time of year. Atlanta, Georgia's BS traffic at 7 p.m., which made me genuinely question with everyone in the car why anyone would want to live in this kind of environment and deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And just over an hour later, exiting I-75 at Dalton, Georgia. Making a couple left turns, running a few blocks over, and pulling into the parking lot of Country Inn and Suites, and meeting up with who will be my chauffeur and mentor for this trip.
Hey.
Really?
Yes, really.
Oh my god.
Do something about it.
Speaking of which, he's pretty much the reason that this entire trip is happening. That's my buddy Andrew out of the Cartersville area. And our aim of this trip, beyond coming up to see him, was to catch whatever we could on the very scenic CSX W&A line between the towns of Cartersville, Georgia and Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, that line isn't exactly busy from what y'all will come to find out. However, Dalton would treat us pretty well in terms of train action, as both CSX and Norfolk Southern trains run through here. Over the next couple days, we'll be running all up and down the CSX W&A and points elsewhere. However, Dalton would be home base for the trip, as between the 2 points that we'd be focusing between, Dalton was just about the midpoint. And as you can see here, has a very nice depot and platform, and the track layout, well, that's a little iffy. But we're not going to worry about that tonight, we'll get to that tomorrow. And just for the record before we start, we were able to capture most of the CSX symbols, however, we're not very good with, nor can the crews call out clearly half the time, the Norfolk Southern symbols. So for those train symbols, if I get any wrong, definitely feel free to comment below this video and correct me on those, because I am not fluent with those, especially the ones that can't call themselves out clearly. After grabbing a bite to eat, we had gotten out to the tracks just after 10 p.m., and we had about an hour and a half to kill before we'd get some sleep to start tomorrow. And Norfolk Southern was right on the money, and with a great start of I have no idea what this train symbol was. Pulled by 3 GEs, headed south through Dalton, our first train would be a mixed intermodal and manifest train. Headed south probably for Atlanta, I'm sure, but beyond that, I'm not sure if or not. As I'll showcase tomorrow, Dalton Georgia's depot is equipped with an ATCS screen visible from the outside, and said ATCS actually works, as in the railroad in this region obviously hasn't switched over to satellite just yet. It works for both NS and CSX, and it showed us that this NS train was about to meet a northbound just to our south. And just after 11:30, crawling out of the darkness would be, and we're not sure on this one, but we believe that this was NS 373. And said 373 would be pulling quite the engine set out of wherever tonight. In the trailing positions, there would be the NS 6920 for honoring our veterans, and some Union Pacific run-through foreign power. If this is 373, he's coming out of Brosen Yard at Macon, Georgia, headed to DeButt's Yard at Chattanooga. Surprisingly enough, the train that would end off tonight would end up being a CSX train, symboled A704, a weekday local based out of Waxahachie, Tennessee, down to here at Dalton, Georgia. .704 is now making the return trip to Waxahachie. Based out of Waxahachie, he works industry customers in between there and here at Dalton, Georgia. But he comes all the way down to Dalton for the purpose of serving Mohawk Industries. Their spurs are giant paved areas that can house covered hoppers, and that's where most of, if not all of the white covered hoppers in his train going north tonight will have been coming from. .704's flashing end of train device would mark the end of tonight, but the trip was only beginning, and we'd be back tomorrow. And the next morning, bright and early, we'd be getting our butts out of here pretty quick so we could see just what we'd find today. Back down to the tracks. Let's take a look at what the track layout here is, because it gets confusing pretty quickly. I'll reference the layout more as the video goes on, but for now let's get a quick overview of what we've got here. Heading down towards the signal bridge, right below us we have the Norfolk Southern's Atlanta North District running between Atlanta and Chattanooga, and right to the left of that we have the branch off to their Dalton siding, which is just shy of 2 miles long if I remember correctly, and as they both single up, they cross the CSX W&A line running between Atlanta, Georgia and Waxahachie, Tennessee. The CSX then crosses from the right side to the left, where on the Norfolk Southern it's referred to as Control Point Hare, and on the CSX it's referred to as Control Point Middle Dalton. As oddly enough, the second diamond that we're flying down to now, accompanied with the switch on the CSX side, is the CSX's Control Point North Dalton, which, and this is where it gets really weird, this is the north end of their Dalton siding, to which they have to cross the NS to access that siding. Though they hardly ever use it, it's just barely over 4,200 feet long. And crossing over it all, the CSX branches off to the left and the NS off to the right, though they'll both end up pretty much in the exact same place in Chattanooga, just a little ways to our north. Branching off the CSX Dalton siding as we head back is their Dalton Yard, which is where local A711 originates and where they have quite a bit of car storage. The Dalton siding consists of these two tracks over here on the left with all the cars in it, while the main line for Dalton siding is all the way on the right here, and the NS still right below us, as they'll switch sides again heading out of town.
How you doing?
A711 we speak of, eh? He's right here, starting his shift out of the southern end of the Dalton Yard and shoving across Morris Street to hook onto some of the cars on the north end here.
10, 5, 4, down to 2. Stretch out one. Good stretch. 3 step.
A711 is an area local switcher working customers in between here at Dalton and Calhoun, Georgia every Monday through Saturday. And after picking up some cars on this side of the road, they would head off south to get that work done.
Honestly, where's the other dude at?
Norfolk Southern, milepost 36.2, no defects.
If the ATCS screen evades you, the defect detector on NS just north of Dalton is usually your last minute warning that a southbound is approaching you, with the exception of northbounds that have just passed and are tripping it their way. This would mark the arrival of NS. I didn't get the symbol on this one either. And without hearing it on the radio, there would be almost no way to get it anyway. Because this was an NS loaded grain train. And the symbols on these can go haywire very quickly. With no set originations, only destinations, and really, no way to get any ID on this one without hearing it through the radio. And we wouldn't get that lucky on this one. As the unknown grain train rounds out of Dalton, it reveals sitting in the siding NS Train 188. Daily auto rack empties out of East Point, Georgia to Detroit, Michigan. The signal improved almost immediately for 188 to roll out, and so they did. As 188 rolls out of the siding, I'm sure all this wind noise is enough to make you question just what it's like up here at this time of year. And the answer to that, 45 degrees at 9 a.m. And with that breeze, this is just the kind of weather we've been waiting for, as the high today wouldn't top 55. Absolute perfect rail fanning weather. At least for me. And at a snail's pace, 188 finally clears the Dalton siding. And with the northbound heading out on NS, we figured that there probably wouldn't be a little bit of action for a while. Oh boy, were we wrong. This guy must have stopped in the very next siding up, because we already had another Norfolk Southern southbound right up the trailhead. The vibrant orange rounds the corner from downtown, signaling the arrival of NS Train 734. Me and Andrew refer to these trains as the run-through coal trains, naming them those off of the BNSF run-through power that these trains almost always have. Train 734 is coal loads off of the BNSF at Memphis, Tennessee, down to Schreer, Georgia. And I don't know if I'm saying that last town name correctly. Just a few minutes, we'd get almost the exact same thing coming back the other way. Having met at Phelps Siding, the next siding to the south of Dalton here, NS Train 735 was now coming north with empty coal hoppers out of Schreer headed back to Memphis. a little antsy here because we've got the whole rest of the video to explore the rest of the northern Georgia sector. But one more train here in Dalton. 65Q would light up the radio just before our departure from Dalton, viewed from the Gordon Street overpass as he crosses the CSX W&A, crossing where we basically just were. With an EMD leader screaming north through Dalton, 65Q is empty ethanol tanks off of the Florida East Coast Railway at Jacksonville, Florida, headed back to Chicago, Illinois. It was neat to see one of these, as these Jacksonville ethanol trains only run maybe once, twice, or maybe 3 times a month. So to see even 64Q's empty counterpart, 65Q, was definitely cool, headed north, out of town now. The same would be true for us in about 20 minutes. As I mentioned before, Dalton was the midpoint for the trip, and today we were going to send our focus to the south. Though headed south from town, we are running pretty blind, because guess what? The W&A ain't that busy. So, time for some sightseeing. There's going to be a lot of this as the video progresses. Coming into the town of Resaca, pulling off on Confederate Cemetery Road, headed down to the Resaca Confederate Cemetery, where tens of soldiers who fought in the Civil War are now buried, souls at rest. Pulling down the canopy-encompassed road, the CSX W&A is pretty much right through the trees, almost right next to the cemetery. And that's a big factor here with the W&A, is that it played a crucial part in the American Civil War. Many of the details on that will come with the video's progression. Back in the woods of Resaca, the cemetery marks the tombstones of many soldiers who to this day remain unknown. All because of and the cemetery established by Mary J. Green. As the story goes, she reportedly found all of the soldiers dead in her front yard one morning, and so she buried them all, having not known any of their names. We'd also come to find out that Mary had a pretty good lifespan for the 1800s, 93 years. Walking back to the top of the hill and down to the tracks, they would be trainless, but still provide a pretty interesting scene, as this here would be the north end of the Resaca siding, with signal cantilevers guarding the siding in Maine coming north, the switch line for the main, and nothing to see here otherwise. We sat here for about 10 more minutes, but it was obvious that nothing was going to show up, so we moved on.
He wants bloopers in this. Yes, you do.
I'm filming.
I didn't ask.
The next stop on the way south would be the small town of Calhoun. It was just after 3 o'clock in the evening now, and still in Calhoun there wasn't much going on. Positioned about halfway between Dalton and Cartersville, Calhoun has a nice freight depot, but it would end up being pretty quiet otherwise. But for once, the trains were not a part of that slumber, as finally, after all day, a CSX train would light up our radios headed south.
811-1321, 0WA 82.4, and it's Rio 511, 3078, JB Warsham. On 1A, you could operate main track both directions. Between the NAS Bowen, Cartersville sub main track, get the milepost SGC 633.0 main track over.
N30511, as needed coal loads out of Evansville, Indiana, down to Stylesboro, Georgia, right around the Bowen area off the Cartersville Subdivision. The Cartersville Subdivision is dark territory, so that dispatch message you heard before the train arrived was the dispatcher giving N305 permission to use the Cartersville sub to run out to Stylesboro. Now, it may have screwed us out of some shots of this train further down the line, but it was worth it. The afternoon sunlight here was on par. Haha, spoiler alert, we were going to try to chase this guy, if not to anywhere in between, down to Cartersville. At least, that was our plan for the next 13 miles, until we came into Adairsville, tailing the train just south of Adairsville up to the Martin Marietta siding, and seeing that there was another train in there, ready to blast off northward once this N305 got by. And we wanted a shot in downtown Adairsville, so we turned the wheel back the other way and ran back up to downtown, and set the tripods back up for E319. With two classic AC 4400 motors on lead power for this train, E319 would be empty coal hoppers out of Cross, South Carolina, back up to Evansville, Indiana for more coal so they can run right back to Cross. It's not often you see two older AC 4400s on power for coal trains like this, as they love to set them up with the DPU style. Some of the AC 44s have been equipped with that capability, but these two haven't, and there's no DPU here. Just an empty string with plenty of power. And downtown Adairsville is definitely a classic old-fashioned town, but as the train clears, I think it's safe to say that this electronic crossing bell is definitely me and Andrew's favorite part about Adairsville. A bit humorous, to say the least. Now, having stopped for that empty coal train, there was no way in you-know-what that we were going to catch back up to that loaded one, so he was out of the question. And we were losing daylight pretty quickly. But continuing the journey south, just north of Kingston now, we found a spot that we liked out in a field, and so we stuck it out, as we heard of a southbound mixed freight train, Q581, clearing Dalton coming south. Having just passed through Adairsville, at 4:48 p.m. the headlight of Q581 finally rounds the corner to pass us here, with what we would believe to go down as the train with the worst horn of the trip. Coming fresh out of Chattanooga, Q581 is daily mixed freight out of Radnor Yard at Nashville, Tennessee, down to Maxwell Yard at Greenwood, South Carolina. Along the way, he'll work the yards at Waxahachie, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, and Lawrenceville, Georgia. And something on this one that we don't see too often down in my territory, a 1x2. A solo leader at the front, paired with two mid-train DPU engines. Running just shy of 9,000 feet long, this definitely wasn't a necessary power setup. It was just how they chose to set it up. That was the end of Q581. And almost the end of the day. We had just under an hour left of daylight in the sky, but we had one more spot that we really wanted to try to get to before the sun completely tapped out. So we'd follow the Q581 down that way, actually catching up to his bottom end a couple of times, but always getting stumped out by every road crossing or traffic light that there was to say no or yes. They all said no. However, radio chatter on the 581 side noted that they were going to meet a northbound in the siding at Ackworth. So, since we had followed 581 all the way down to Allatoona, we'd break off the chase there, heading over to our Allatoona spot, and we'd hop back on the main line once this northbound got its move on. Welcome to what once was Allatoona Pass. Right atop this hill that's behind the sign now, was at one time the Western and Atlantic Railroad and their line to Chattanooga, which is now for the most part the CSX W&A line, with this small memorial and trailhead that has now been set up for the part of the Allatoona Pass that had to be taken out once Lake Allatoona flooded the pass back in 1954. Walking to the top of the berm for Lake Allatoona, Under the sunset, you can see just how big this reservoir is. Up until the flooding in 1954, this berm used to be the roadbed for the original Allatoona Pass, which cut through the mountains here in a 175-foot deep cut, which is now this empty path leading off into the woods. Though it's not visible now, as pretty much everything has grown back, there are still the two hills on either side of this cut, and back during the American Civil War, almost all of the vegetation was removed from the top of these hills so that Union soldiers could get a clear vantage point and view out over the Allatoona battlefield. And one final interesting point to note, the plantation building visible in this photograph is still standing today, just across the road, right there. Moving just up Old Allatoona Road to the tracks that do still exist, there's another unknown marker. This one for an unknown hero. Another gravestone with an unknown recipient. Essentially what all of this is saying here is that this tomb is marked as an unknown hero, as there's two different stories as to who this could have been. But suggested evidence found says that this was Andrew Jackson Houston from the Confederates 35th Mississippi Infantry. Barring the details, he was one of the few recognized soldiers who died in the Battle of Allatoona, with his grave marked an unknown hero, somebody who died for the cause they thought was right. And as somebody reporting on this from the 21st century, I'm just going to leave it at that. Moving back up to the road crossing, we can see where the Allatoona Pass started, and where the secondary track now curves off to the left, with the original Allatoona Pass having started just shy of what is now this road crossing somewhere off in this corner. Marked the W&A on CSX transportation now, was quiet as per usual. There wasn't any action now, but there was about to be soon. Remember that northbound that was supposed to meet Q581 in the siding at Ackworth? Well, it's been almost 40 minutes now. That should definitely be close to done. So I had a shot in mind, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but we gave it a shot. The giant bridge over the Etowah River. It was almost 7 p.m. now, and the sun was completely gone, and there were no lights at this bridge, or anywhere around it for that matter. But I still did want to try to get this shot while I was here. Although we did have an LED floodlight stashed in our car, so we thought we'd give that a shot. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but I plugged it in anyway and shined it up. And with that and the help of a couple of pointer flashlights, I gotta say, damn, this shot was kinda worth it. On an initial glance and a lack of a radio identification, we assumed this to be Q648, a daily mixed freight train coming out of Waycross, Georgia, headed up to Chicago, Illinois, but that was a misidentification as we'd come to find out later. Crossing over the river, our northbound is just shy of 8,000 feet long, and in a few miles up the line, he was about to go over two defect detectors. The first one at milepost 0WA 47.4. This Cartersville defect detector is like many you've heard before. This one accounts for dragging equipment, hot boxes, train length, axle count, and what have you. However, right in the same general area, there's another kind that I've never heard before. At milepost 0WA 47.36, there's a fairly uncommon wheel impact load detector, or WILD for short. These detectors aren't all that common, with only about 300 reportedly installed to date, but they are an essential maintenance feature. These detectors measure vertical wheel forces via rail-mounted strain gauges. Defective wheels could damage rolling stock, cargo, and the track itself. This will let the train crew know if they have a defective axle, and so that it can be removed at wherever is next possible. A female voice on this one too, something else you don't really hear much anywhere.
CSX impact detector milepost 4.36. Track 1 northbound. No defects. Repeat, no defects. Total axle count 642. Impact detector out.
The sun was gone for today, so it was about time for us to start making our way back north to home base, Dalton. But we were still indirectly following that northbound, and we felt like another shot at downtown Adairsville, so we pulled off there again, with only a few minutes to spare. Big eye catcher for me on this one was all of the maintenance of way equipment at the very front of this consist. CSX has a certain number of flatbed trains meant to carry all of these different pieces of maintenance equipment so they can transport them all to different regions when they're needed. These maintenance crews are also commonly referred to as track gangs. It is November and we are fairly deep in the south, so it is CSX's maintenance season in this region, so it's not surprising to see the stuff moving around at this point, but it's definitely cool to see. With their 6 locomotive consist at the head, this would end up not being Q648 to Chicago, but rather we'd find out later that this was Q514, not a regular visitor to the W&A. 514 runs from Rice Yard at Waycross up to Nashville, Tennessee, although he doesn't usually run this way as he works Boyle's Yard in Birmingham, Alabama. But either not having that to do or possibly crew preference ended up sending him up the W&A.
You know, this part ain't even worth narrating. I'm just gonna say in person. I'm just gonna say in person that I'm including this because this is the biggest damn gas station. The biggest gas station I've ever seen in my life. Buc-ee's. I did not expect to come across this on our trip to the W&A, so you know what? It's gonna make it into the video. This is where we're getting gas on night 2.
I literally just told you about this too. Like, we should go there. You're like, what's a Buc-ee's?
Look at this. Okay, I thought I was done until I saw this thing. Look at this thing. What is this, the mascot? What are you doing?
Rubbing it.
They got a beaver. Take every American restaurant, grocery store, and clothing store. It's in here.
This calls America.
It's literally all in
Look
here.
at the sign. It's like 100 feet tall.
You're literally basically coming to a one-level IKEA. I'm not a vlogger, so I'm not about to do a tour, but oh my god, the inside of this place is insane. These are, you can buy these. You can buy these. Can you buy this? You can buy this.
999. You can get a drone for less than this, and it's way bigger.
Yeah. The drone's not bigger than this.
I'm saying no, this is way bigger. The drone's $1,000, and this is like 80,000 times bigger.
I got small Buc-ee's.
Hey, and large Buc-ee's.
Hey, nice.
69.
Hey.
Put the camera in there.
I don't want to go. It's already 43 out. I'm good.
It's worth it, okay? You can get into your sand for $9.99. Shipping plus taxing.
Now back in Dalton after finally getting some food, we get back to the tracks in time for N319 at 9:45 p.m. Now on a return trip from Evansville, Indiana, N319 is the southbound sister to the E319 that we saw this afternoon down in Adairsville. He's bringing this 6,000 feet of coal back down to Cross, South Carolina. It was already surprising enough that we came back to a CSX train calling signals through Dalton, and on top of that it was a unit coal train. And that's pretty nice to come back to, isn't it? Now, without the sun's glare on the outside windows, we can take a look at the ATCS screen visible from the outside, which is on 24/7 and still works for both railroads here. Now, if we take a look at what's currently happening on the screen, we have a southbound Norfolk Southern train lined across the diamonds through Dalton, indicated by these green lines coinciding with each signal block. Headed north, you'd be over here, and south over here, with the Dalton Depot and Second Diamond, where we are now, located right here. And the green signal blocks for this oncoming train only start right here, indicating that he's only a couple of signal blocks away, so it's time to get set up. We'd use that time to hop on over to the Gordon Street overpass and set up for NS train 264, southbound intermodal, another Memphis, Tennessee train, this one headed down to Charlotte, North Carolina. On Norfolk Southern, many of the Memphis originators are coming off of the BNSF and will often have BNSF power, and this one was no exception. Whether due to the territory they run through or the people they serve, NS has always been a different breed. You never really see these flatbed trailers on well cars anywhere else. As another reference point, obviously 264 is running south on NS, and the main line for CSX is right here on the right. Their siding and yard off to the left here where these cars are, and an abandoned interchange track all the way on the right there. 11:23 p.m. The gates come down on Morris Street for our last train of day 2, NS train 229. Daily container traffic out of Chicago, Illinois, down to Jacksonville, Florida, and the FEC. That was the conclusion on day 2, and we're already up to 40 minutes of video time. Though the next day wasn't as action-packed, it was more sightseeing than anything else. But let's get to day 3. Day number 3. Pulling out of the hotel parking lot, we'd be headed back down to the Dalton Depot tracks, just for a little bit though, as since we did everything to the south yesterday, our focuses today would be to the north. And pulling out of the parking lot this morning, I'd find out that Biden has a very questionable approval rating. Arriving back at Morris Street, our first sight of the day would be a northbound Norfolk Southern mixed freight train that had pulled up and come to a stop in the Dalton siding. And then a few minutes later, another Norfolk Southern southbound train who tripped the DD and called out his identification very clearly. Yet another NS 734. Memphis, Tennessee to Schweer, Georgia. I still don't know if I'm saying that town name correctly. Here's another one of the run-through coal trains with some more run-through power. 2 BNSF SD70 ACEs would be the lead motors for this one, with 2 more pumpkins stuck on the bottom.
734, clear, signal north Dalton. Approach here, 734.
With what we now knew to be NS 373 parked in the siding here, we figured that he had stopped there to meet this southbound 734, though we'd come to find out that they were tying the train down here in Dalton for a number of hours, as the crew would get off and not return for a while. At least not for the time that we were here. And as 734 passed, it looks like the conductor from 373 had a taste for breakfast at this time, as he'd make a quick run into the Cremo drive-in just across the tracks on Morris Street. About an hour goes by and the ATCS screen lights up again. Another Norfolk Southern southbound, the last one that we'd shoot before making our way north. This was what we believed to be NS 223. Daily container traffic out of Kansas City, Missouri, down to East Point, Georgia. We moved back to the Gordon Street overpass for this one, as now that the sun was up, you could see a little bit more of what's happening around here. Well, guess I forgot to mention that this guy also had auto racks as well on the bottom. That train was crossed the diamonds. It was our time to start making our way north up the W&A. Sought site number 1, Tunnel Hill. Only about 7 track miles north of Dalton, Tunnel Hill is reported to have the only railroad tunnel in Georgia. The signals here protect the south end of the Tunnel Hill siding, and on the W&A today, Tunnel Hill is a favorite spot for dispatchers to schedule meets and whatnot, as with the W&A being very old-fashioned and a lot of it left over from the Civil War, many of the sidings are very small. A few examples of those are Dalton, 4,200 feet, Kingston, 5,600 feet, Emerson, 7,900 feet, Graysville at 6,400 feet, and then there's Tunnel Hill at just shy of 12,000 feet. With many of the train CSX runs nowadays coming up to or exceeding the length of Tunnel Hill, all of the other sidings can sometimes be useless. But at the same time, the W&A isn't exactly busy nowadays either, so as you may have expected, we weren't going to see anything here at Tunnel Hill. But there were quite a few historic landmarkers to take a look at. Here's another example of, and the first example I'm showing, because I've neglected to explain it thus far, Sherman's neckties. General William Sherman of the Union forces used this technique to render any of the railroad tracks used by the Southern Confederacy all but useless. This was accomplished by tearing apart the track itself, making stacks of the wooden ties like shown here, and placing the rails on top of them. The stack of timbers would then be lit on fire. The fire would burn the wood to ash, and the metal rail on top would heat up from the fire and buckle under its own weight, bending it out of shape, rendering it useless. If the rail was still hot, they could bend it further if they deemed necessary. Many of these old rails were recovered from marshes in the area, so it's almost crazy to see them all still intact here. Tunnel Hill, along with its other historic landmarkers, has a visitor center and historic depot, which also hosts tours through the original Western and Atlantic Railroad tunnel. It's not visible from back here, but off to the right of where the new CSX tunnel is now, the original bore through the Tunnel Hill Ridge still stands. That tunnel was abandoned and the new tunnel was constructed in 1929 as trains were getting longer and, more importantly, taller, to a point that the old tunnel could not accommodate. Tunnel Hill in this region is a very old-fashioned southern town, and as much as I wish we could have caught a train here, we didn't. But even if you're up here and it's just to come out here and see it, you might as well make a stop at Tunnel Hill, because it's a really quiet, peaceful place. Only about 5 track miles north of Tunnel Hill is the town of Ringgold. The downtown and backstreet neighborhood roads marked all with flags and memorials for individual Union and Confederate soldiers who fought during the war. Taking these roads about another 2 track miles to the north, right at about milepost 0WA 116, is another trackside memorial, this one a stone block, imprinted with a general description of the Great Locomotive Chase, another large event of the American Civil War. This marker represents the location where the Great Locomotive Chase came to an end. Being pursued by the Confederate forces, the Great Locomotive Chase consisted of Union soldiers taking a locomotive north on the Western Atlantic Railroad and along their route to Chattanooga, tearing up and damaging as much of the line as possible to render as much of it useless as possible. And at this location here, now off Highway 151, around milepost 116, is where the locomotive was abandoned, to where the entire pursuit was then continued on foot. Again, no trains for us here, but since we were up here and trying to see as many historical markers as we could, this was one of the places we'd hit on our way to now Chattanooga, Tennessee. Winding through the very colorful hills of what is the very bottom of Tennessee. The yard at Chattanooga was to be our next location, specifically Norfolk Southern's D-Butts yard. And to view said yard, we'd pull up to a very popular railfan location in this area, Coffey's Cliff. And within just seconds of us walking over to the ledge, it already gave us a taste of the action that we were here to receive. Put it this way, for the roughly 2.5 hours that we were here for, there was always something moving or sitting on one of these alignments. Yard jobs, freight trains, road trains, everything. Something was moving, or at least sitting right in front of us here. There were at least 3 or 4 pairs of road slugs switching out the yard constantly while we were here, whether they were up to the cliff or not. We'd watch 2 mixed freights build out their trains from the yard, this one here, and then another one that would start building on the very far track. For the record, no, I did not get the symbols on these. And more yard jobs consisting of these same road slug pairs. And probably the biggest surprise for us while we were sitting here, we could see that the Norfolk Southern safety train was sitting in the yard, and as one of the yard jobs reversed in about notch 8, NS Jeep 38-2 number 5642 appeared from the yard as well. He would then hook onto the safety consist, and that would signify that by sheer chance we were about to catch Norfolk Southern train 937 on its departure from here at Chattanooga, destination Atlanta. This 8-car set of uniquely painted rolling stock has all been customized and fitted to help train first responders regarding rail-themed incidents. And every now and then, or when the railroad deems necessary, they'll send it all around the country, hosting these multitudes of training sessions all over. And within the next few days, there were obviously sessions set to be held down in Atlanta, Georgia. 5642 was painted in the same scheme as the train set, which makes it a unique find. This would be my first ever catch of the NS safety train, and come to think of it, it will probably be my last. Spinning around as the safety train exits, there's a high green on the mast for a southbound CSX train here at their control point east end. Chattanooga and here at Coffey's Cliff is basically their gateway to the W&A south to Atlanta. And there aren't many signals around here besides this one. There's a defect detector nearby, but that didn't go off, and neither did any of the callings for any other signals around. So this southbound snuck up on us, and it's only thanks to Andrew that I was able to catch this shot on my camera as the train rounded. posting a pair of classic AC 4400 locomotives on lead would be CSX loaded coal train N302. Another Cartersville sub coal train, Evansville, Indiana down to Stylesboro, Georgia. Essentially another run of the same coal train that we caught southbound in Calhoun yesterday. In CSX's whole new era of running distributed power locomotives on just about everything in this regard, seeing old AC 4400 duos on the leads of coal trains has become a very less common sight nowadays, although in recent months it's become possible again, such as here, with number 567 on lead having been given DPU capabilities a few months prior, allowing them to run this ES44AH as a mid-train distributed engine. Followed by even more remote switchers pulling cars in and out of the yard. By this time it was nearing 3 o'clock, and we had one more place that we had wanted to hit while we still had some daylight left in the sky. What me and Andrew call the river. Following Interstate 24 west out of Chattanooga for about 20 miles, hopping over a time zone, and then winding down and around Shell Mound Road, encompassed by tree canopies, falling leaves, and deathly slopes just outside your window. Winding down into the valley just outside of New Hope, Tennessee, our destination, the river, will be better known to you Tennessee and Georgia residents as Nickajack Lake. This spot intrigued our interest heavily because it runs right along the lake and pretty much right out into it. As crossing the river, there's only one small landmass spanning across it, which is only just big enough to hold the track and road side by side. The single track that runs across the river here is owned by CSX, although Norfolk Southern and CSX both have trackage rights along here, and you can see both types of trains running here. Coming out of Chattanooga, the CSX and Norfolk Southern merge onto this line and will separate again further west over in Stevenson, Alabama. And as for the one automatic block signal along this stretch, on both railroads it's control point Shell Mound. And as much as it kills me to say these two things, number one, we'd have to part ways with Andrew here. It was his time to head back home. We'd still have the night and part of tomorrow to catch trains, but for him, it was the end of the road. As my chauffeur, mentor, and spaceship Gramps would both turn around and head back east up Shell Mound Road, off into the autumn-plagued wilderness. And the second thing that kills me to say, we would sit here until sundown, and we would not see one train. It was such a pain because this spot is just utterly gorgeous, and its visual appeal made it one of the most intriguing sights along this journey, and one of my most anticipated the entire trip. But it was a relaxing 2.5 hours that we'd sit here before the sun went down just after 4:45. And, well, I guess all I could do was sit here and ask myself, why can't Florida ever look this mesmerizing? A number of hours later, now at 9 p.m. sharp, we're back in Dalton for another NS-229, Chicago, Illinois to Jacksonville, Florida, containers and UPS. Just a few short minutes later on the CSX side, their northward signal would advance to a high green, marking what would be the first northbound CSX road train that I'd catch here in Dalton. Running up the W&A now was Q580. hour through Dalton, Q580 is daily mixed freight northbound from Case, South Carolina to Waxahachie, Tennessee. Along his journey, he'll work Maxwell Yard at Greenwood, South Carolina, where Q581 from earlier was going, Lawrenceville, Georgia, Howell Yard in Atlanta, and finally Waxahachie, Tennessee when he gets there. Swinging to the left through downtown, 580 is crossing the Norfolk Southern's Atlanta North District to Chattanooga, right at the diamond down here, and we'll get a little closer to this one for our last train of tonight. As 580 clears the diamonds, the ATCS setup would let us know that there was a Norfolk Southern train just north of town waiting for him to get across. And I got the symbol for this one, but this is where the Norfolk Southern IDs get very, very screwy. And maybe this is because I'm not educated on them enough, but beyond that, I've got no idea, as this one was symboled 44R. Calling out his symbol clearly enough for me to hear through the radio, 44R is a loaded grain train, and according to the train symbol's website, it's stenciled as grain loads from an unknown origin to Cresson, Pennsylvania, which seems very inaccurate considering he was heading south loaded through Dalton, but that's what he called. And that's what makes Norfolk Southern grain train symbols so hard to figure out without hearing them, is because none of their origins are specified, only destinations, and in this case it doesn't even look like said destination is even accurate. Correct me if I'm wrong, but these white hoppers may as well have symbolized a ghost train, as I've got no idea where this guy was coming from or where he was headed.
Dalton heading south, Q58313, CSX D488 out.
Oddly enough, our last train for the night would end up being another CSX train, a southbound mixed freight Q583. Mixed freight daily from Radnor Yard at Nashville, Tennessee, down to Hamlet, North Carolina. I moved down to the first diamond of Norfolk Southern's Atlanta District and the W&A to get 583 grinding across it as he snakes his way through Dalton with a trio of GEs. Along 583's run to Hamlet, he'll work Howell Yard in Atlanta, Maxwell Yard in Greenwood, South Carolina, and Monroe, North Carolina. Having frequented the railroad crossings such as the ones at Plant City, Crawford, and even Nahunta on my channel, we're more used to seeing the 90-degree completely horizontal to vertical diamond interlockings. But the two diamonds here at Dalton are a couple of the examples of some of the more commonly seen interlockings, with these two being set at what looks closer to be a 10 to 30 degree angle. As Q583 coming south crosses over the NS Atlanta North District from the left side to the right as you look north. The diamond set in place for the Heart of Georgia short line to cross the CSX's Fitzgerald Subdivision down in Cordele, Georgia, is a closer representation of what these diamonds here are. And as 583 picks up speed out of town, it goes to show that even these shallower diamonds can make their fair share of noise. .583's marker lights would put an end on our final full day in North Georgia. The dawn of tomorrow would mark the end.
Dispatcher, Jackson, answering.
Well, this was it. We had a good 9-hour drive to make back to our residence, but a couple of trains would light up the radio while we still had some time left, and another CSX train, A711 from a couple of days ago, was now on a new shift on a new day, now Monday the 15th, bringing a few covered hoppers out of the storage in Dalton Siding, presumably to take them down to Mohawk Industries, which is the same place that all of those covered hoppers came out of when A704 ran north on night 1. Then right behind him, a Norfolk Southern train would light up the radio. Another local headed to the exact same place, with 2 covered hoppers, merging off into their Dalton siding just beyond the diamond. An SD40-2 on power for this one. I don't believe that this local job usually comes up this far from the industry, so it was cool to see, especially with an NS SD40 as power. Mohawk Industries is shared by both CSX and Norfolk Southern, with industry and yard leads on each side of the track for each railroad, so it's likely that both of these 2 recent trains were headed there. That was all the action that Dalton would provide for us on this trip. It was time to start making the run back south. But, as it seems to always go, there's always one more. Just one more. I had heard about this one the night before, and now this morning as they had gotten a crew to leave Atlanta northbound, he was nearing us from the south, and I didn't really feel like waiting on him in Dalton, but rather possibly trying to hit a spot on the W&A further south that we may have missed on day 2. And that would be so, but we would come to improvise pretty hard, as we begin to run out of space between the northbound train and the southbound us. But just north of the town of Kingston, pulling off at Old Hall Station Road, I presumed we had plenty of time, but oh no, the gates were coming down right as we pulled up, with just enough time to get the tripod out and set it all up for our northbound ethanol empties. Screaming north through Kingston would be CSX train K492. The as-needed movement of empty ethanol tankers out of Lawrenceville, Georgia, back up to Union Pacific's Proviso Yard in Chicago, where CSX will hand the train back off to them. 2 of UP's motors and a Norfolk Southern rebuild made its way onto this train apparently on the way south, and now for the trip north. And with the train speeding by, there's no other way to put this. This is just about how the trip comes to an end. And wow, what a way to end it off. Google Maps had told me that from where we were, Interstate 75, which we had to take to get back home, had veered far away from where we now were, to where we'd have to drive back north to Adairsville to get back to the interstate. And on our drive back up that way, K492 would have stopped between the switches at Martin Marietta just south of Adairsville, allowing us to park the car and walk back up the Highway 140 overpass in Adairsville to catch the train one last time. And barring the possibly obvious details, huge thanks to my great friend Andrew for making this probably one of my best, if not my best trip to date, and that I thank y'all for watching, especially if you did sit through this entire hour of trains and history, and I'll use this final clip to end it all off. So I'll type out the rest, but otherwise, I'll see you hopefully next time back home on the Sunshine State Rails.